I've been teaching for the last 37 years. I've taught approximately 5,000 people. And if you multiply that by 48 hours per person, that's a lot of hours. And I've done a bit of research for that time. I haven't done that. In the meantime, since I've been in Mexico, I'm a member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences. I belong to the system of national investigators. Actually, I've been an evaluator of that. So I get the thankless job of evaluating other people whether they can get into a system of national investigators. Which is not a bad deal, When you enter, there are 3 different levels, right? When you enter, well, there are 4 different levels. When you enter as a candidato, then you go to level 1, level 2, and level 3. And once you go to level 3, they give you 14 salarios mínimos libre de impuestos. And that's apart from what you get your salary and stuff like that. It's pretty good. So I have been a member of level 3 for the last 15 years. Part of that time I have been an evaluator, and being an evaluator is really a thankless job, because when people get in, they think it's their own credit, and when they don't get in, they think it's your fault. It's sort of the same thing happens when the students get a good grade, they think, I did great. If they get a bad grade, they think it's teachers' fault. So I've learned a few things over this period of time, and so I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about that stuff now. Right now, you're 20-something years old, you don't really care about what happens in the rest of the life, but sooner or later they will come. And sometimes sooner than you think. When I started college, I was going to study engineering. I was going to be an engineer, and I got into the engineering college, which is I was born in India, so I was doing my studies in India, and it turned out that right at that time my father had a business and it failed spectacularly. So I couldn't study engineering. And there was another institute where they actually, it's an institute for mathematics and statistics, and they actually give you a beca, not just for your colegiatura, but also for your manutención. So from the age of 16, I've been independent of my family. I didn't have to rely on my family at all. In fact, I didn't live with my family anymore. So that helped. And then later on, I went and did a PhD in the US. Again, if you get into a PhD program, typically they give you becas of some sort. Not only, by then, not only I didn't need my family to help me, I was actually helping them back in India. So, let me start with that at the very beginning. It's one important thing is to be punctual. And as you might have noticed, it's not exactly the strong point in Mexico for most people. But that's not particularly true for just Mexico. It's true in India. In India, when you hear, I remember one time, first year I was here, somebody invited me to a wedding. So I said, okay, there we go. I was going to be at such church at 8 o'clock. So I said, okay, I'll be there at 8 o'clock. Went there at 8 o'clock. There was absolutely nobody. And the place was closed. I was completely baffled. What happened? And so there was some lady who was selling little sweets on the side of the street. So I said, do you know anything about what's going on here? She said, what time did they say? I said, 8 o'clock. She said, oh, that means 9 o'clock. That was my first lesson in what the time and timeliness means. Again, as I said, this is not just true for Mexico, it's true for other countries as well. So in India we say, if somebody says, oh, we have a party which starts at 8 o'clock at night. So then the next question you ask, is it the Indian Standard Time? Which means that it's an hour late. In Malaysia there's a phrase called rubber time. You know, rubber expands. So rubber time, if you say 8 o'clock rubber time, which means you add another hour. But the point is that it's not just it costs you in terms of time, it costs others. Imagine if I come in every day to my class half an hour late. Well, not only I'm half an hour late, you are all losing half an hour. So multiply that by 25. Half an hour multiplied by 25, that's the opportunity cost of the entire group. Same thing happens when you get on a bus. Sometimes, but not often, I get on the ITAM bus to go home, Metro Miguel Ángel de Quevedo, and the bus driver is late. There are 30-40 people inside the bus, and bus driver hasn't arrived. Again, it's costly. If you think about as a societal problem, this is costly to the society. And most of the advanced nations, if you look at, one of the things they do seriously, they take it very, very seriously, is to be on time. The other thing is being truthful about things. So if you lie to somebody, they may not catch on the first time around. If you do it 5 times, then they will figure out, this person is not very reliable. They say things that are not necessarily true. And you see that happen again. If I take the case of Mexico, typically people will say, oh, I'm late because of the bad traffic. It may not be the traffic at all. Maybe that person started late from home to get there wherever they're going. And that happens a lot. And the trouble is that, if I lie about something, then I have to be consistent about lying about the same thing over and over again. Otherwise, they will figure out, that person said something then, now he's saying something else. So the point is that if you stick to the truth, you just only have to remember one thing, and that's not hard to do. If you lie, you have to remember lots of different lies that you have told to lots of different people, and that's very difficult to keep track of. Third thing, most of the time when you're learning something, the most important thing in life is human capital. And we don't always appreciate that all the time. Of course, if you have inherited billions of dollars, then it really doesn't matter. But most people do not have that. So what you have as students, and not necessarily students, outside in your life, learning things that are useful, that can become useful in your life later on, that you don't know necessarily that it will become useful. And that's the part that most people don't really realize, that if you're learning something, you might say, well, why am I doing all this thing now? Why do I need to know how to calculate the premium for life insurance, for example? And the thing is that the same kind of concept actually applies in lots of other fields that you will find out later on. And the concepts that you learn can become useful in other things. So the idea is that more you have in your toolkit, the better you are at applying them to different circumstances. And what I mean by that is, suppose you learn right now, for example, I urge all the students to learn another language. When I say another language, I don't necessarily mean Japanese. You learn art, for example. That's very, very useful in all sorts of things that you might want to apply to. So if you say, wow, I really don't care about actuarial stuff, I'll do something else. The point is that once you learn something like art, it is applicable to a whole bunch of other things, like if you want to do data science, if you want to analyze large bodies of data, R is very useful. Or it doesn't have to be R. You say, I don't really like R, I want to learn Hadoop, which is also great. If you look at Google Maps, that's what drives Google Maps. When you see the things, it just goes, you go around the map. The language they use is Hadoop. And that's another very useful tool to have. So again, when you're learning this stuff, sometimes it's not very clear what it is going to be useful for. It becomes clearer at some other point in time. And sometimes you learn something that you may not use at all for many years, and all of a sudden it becomes useful. So the more you have in your toolkit, the more you can apply to all sorts of different things. The other thing that happens is that when you actually teach other people, I don't necessarily mean that you actually become teacher, professor or something. When you explain things to other people, you find out that you yourself really have not understood the concept very well. It happens to me all the time. It happens to me all the time. I think, okay, I'm going to explain this to the class, and it's very clear to me. And when I say it in the class, then people just kind of look at me, and when I ask them a question, I realize they haven't understood what I said. Which is, when you have got 20 people who don't understand, it's not their fault, it's your fault that you really didn't know how to explain that because you did not understand that properly. So when you educate others in that broad sense, then it becomes useful to yourself. You have a deeper understanding of what you are trying to explain. And that's very useful on other things. Which brings me back to becoming a professor. I just had a student who came in the other day, and she was my thesis student, and then she went on to do a PhD in Holland, and then she came back, and just yesterday she said she had 2 job offers. One is at a central bank, the other is at a university, and she's in a dilemma which one to take. I said, both are great options. You should be delighted that you have 2 options. Most people don't have that many options. You have 2 great options. So whichever you take, it's really good. But you really want to ask yourself whether you want to do that for the rest of your life. So, for example, if you start working in Banco de Mexico, great job. However, it comes at a cost. And the cost is that you will never see your children again awake. Because you go at 6 o'clock in the morning, you come back at midnight. And that's the nature of the beast. So most of the time you work long hours. Of course you get paid more. On the other hand, if you are a university professor, you have a lot of flexibility in your job. So, for example, I teach classes at 7 o'clock in the morning every day. But then, after 8:30, then all the time is mine. So, I have a lot of time for advising students for doing their thesis or doing my own research and so on and so forth. So everything is, you know, as a trade-off. So when you take one option, it's good in some sense, it's not so good in other sense. And other options have different trade-offs. So I'd say, 37 years of teaching, I consider it a decent life. And depending on how you go about it, it's not, you know, if you are a teacher in a high school, it doesn't pay much. It doesn't matter which country it is, except in Scandinavia. But if you are a university professor, decent university, then it pays reasonably well. ITAM pays reasonably well. All right. Start dreaming big. And what I mean by that is dream big, but within reason. It doesn't have to be this reality. No? So, for example, if you say, I'm going to win the Nobel Prize, well, that's hit or miss. You really have to be at the right place at the right time in order for that to happen. And same thing with other big rewards like that. And typically, when you actually get the Nobel Prize, you're already too old anyway. So really, most of the time when people get their Nobel Prizes, they have already retired from their regular jobs. And that's not surprising because the impact of your work, whatever you're doing, takes a long time for it to actually show. Most people don't get their Nobel Prizes in their 20s, although there are some examples. There's one guy called Lawrence Bragg. He got a Nobel Prize when he was 25. And it's not a Nobel Peace Prize, it was in physics. Hardcore stuff. But that's an exception. Most people don't do that. The trick is to try to be in lots of different places at the same time. And that way you can, you might hit at the right spot and that might develop into something else. And that works reasonably well. For example, when I was doing my PhD, I went to University of Minnesota, and at that time Minnesota was just rising in terms of its reputation in economics, and but it was not, one of the considered at that time was not considered one of the top universities for doing PhD in economics. However, when I got in, then it started getting a bigger and bigger reputation. Eventually, 4 of my professors got Nobel Prize in economics. Of course, that's after I left. So, but at least I can say, hey, I have 4 teachers who were Nobel Prize winners, which helps sometimes in jobs when you apply for jobs. When people who write your letters of recommendation happen to be Nobel Prize winners. One of my other, after I did my PhD, I taught a few years in the US. Then I went to Singapore, I was there for 3 years, and then I went to Australia, and that's where I lived for many years before I came here. And in Australia, I started at my job at a university which was not yet there. The university started when I got in. After I got in, we started the university. We wrote all the courses and everything, what has to be taught and so on and so forth. And So I got into the university. I taught first day, first class, 8 o'clock in the morning at the university. And then it started raining. And the roofs were not yet waterproof. And so the water started pouring in. I had to put the garbage can in underneath the thing so that water does not go down on the floor. I remember that. But the guy who happened to be the rector of the university, he was an American. And he came from South Carolina. And he was a president of a small university there. So he came to Australia, and then he, and you know, since we started the university, at that time there were about 20 people in the whole faculty. So I got to know him very well, and so on. And then he went back to the US and started helping with some candidates for presidency, and one of his classmates, they went to Harvard together, became the president of the United States, Bill Clinton. So he became the chief of staff at the White House. So when I came to ITAM, for example, one of my letter of references was from Phil Lader, which said 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and gave me the letter of reference. So obviously people at ITAM was very impressed. So having known somebody like that, you know, is very useful. And the guy who became the chancellor of the university at Bond University at that time, he was another lawyer, and 5 years ago he became the Prime Minister of Australia. Again, having known people like that helps. Not that I'm looking for a job anymore. In fact, I'm just about to retire. This is my last class. So, one of the things that you really need to do is that you push yourself. So I knew, for example, when I was in high school, I was not the smartest kid in the class. Okay, I accepted that. But then I worked really hard. So I did better than almost all of them. Same thing in college. When I studied, you know, I was not the best student in class either. Again, I worked hard, and that helped. Similarly, when I started doing research, again, the trick is to work hard. And there is no other substitute for that. So, for example, one of the things that you do as researchers is you publish papers and books and stuff like that. So when you publish papers, what exactly how does it get published? Well, you send it to them, and then somebody reviews them. Well, you do 2-3 people, and then they give you comments. Most of the times, and I mean most of the times, they reject your paper. On the average, if you look at a good, reputable journal, 80 to 90% of the papers are rejected. So I had my share of rejections. Nevertheless, I published 150 papers. So a lot of them got rejected many times. I had one paper getting rejected 14 times. So the trick is to pick yourself up and go. If you take that to heart, you know, you say, well, I cannot do it, then that's not going to happen. So the trick is to pick yourself up and go. And the same thing with classes. If you do badly in one exam, you say, well, I give up. No, you don't give up. You continue on. Of course, you have to pick the right thing. You know, if you cannot do mathematics at all, you should not be doing an actuarial studies major. So within reason, find your spot and then go for it. The other thing that most people don't quite get is if you really, really hate your job, that's not really what you should be doing, because that's just going to get worse and worse and worse. So pick something that you enjoy. If you are doing something you don't enjoy, then eventually that's going to really affect the rest of your life as well. And if you enjoy what you are doing, eventually you will make money. Doesn't matter what the area is. You may not get really, really rich. Very few people become Bill Gates or people like that. But you can make a reasonable life out of what you do. And so finding what you do is really something that you should really look for. Ask yourself, do I really want to do that? I mean, I had lots of students in actuarial studies. I had one girl who did her thesis with me. This was 20 years ago, and all of a sudden I get an email from her. I haven't heard from her for 20 years. And she sent me an email saying, you know the thesis I did? I said, yeah, I remember. I want to apply that in real life. I said, okay. So I went and looked at her thesis again, because I had forgotten what she'd done. And she had done a proposal on how you should save on your own so that you can have enough money when you retire. And her parents just retired, and she realized that they had not done what she said they should be doing. And so in the meantime, what she's been doing really had nothing to do with actuarial studies at all. So when she was finishing her thesis, her basic job was to sell flowers. She had a floreria. And she still has the floreria. And she does supply for big events, like big weddings. And she has contracts with Televisa, and she supplies them with, they have all these floral arrangements for shows and stuff. She does all of that. Business does really well. And she also does real estate business. And that's where she realized that people should save their money, which is related to properties. And that's a very good way against hedging inflation in Mexico. And that's true. In Mexico, there are very few instruments most people have access to that hedge against inflation. If you buy government bonds and stuff, they are mostly not inflation indexed. There are UDI bonos and stuff like that, which is not bad, but it does not pay you very much interest. Whereas if you are in real estate, one way or the other, that generates stream of income in the meantime. The other thing is exercise. Again, when you're young, you may not realize that what you do, exercise now, that has a long-term impact on your body. You do something at 20, that really produces benefits at 60. I know, I am at 60. For example, I do yoga. Actually, I have a certificate of, it's like equivalent of a maestria in yoga. I've been doing yoga since I was 6 years old. And it started with, I had a problem with my tonsils. Went to the doctor, they said, you have to operate that. So my father said, well, let me get a second opinion. So he took me to a yoga teacher, and he said, I'll fix it in 3 months. And it fixed doing yoga. No medicine, nothing. And so I got interested in yoga. I did 5 years of learning myself, and then I started teaching. Again, I taught a whole bunch of people yoga. In fact, I started the first yoga class in ITAM 21 years ago. People said back then, "What is yoga?" so I had my students to take my classes, and I have taught yoga in gyms and stuff, basically for free. I have taught at various universities. I used to teach an executive MBA class where these students would come in, and the classes would go from 8 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, with 1 hour lunch break. Every day for 7 days consecutive, 5 days consecutive. So they were like regular courses but compacted in 1 week. And these little were like this. So I actually got them to do yoga in the class. And that, you know, that relaxed them a lot more than otherwise they would have. So again, this is just one example. It doesn't have to be yoga. It could be all different things. All of them help your body. Take care of your family and friends. And this is, again, another thing that, you know, you may take your parents granted. That's not the right thing to do. You really find out over the long haul that you cannot do everything on your own. You have to rely on other people. And family and friends are the ones that help you in the long run. So, for example, the people I studied with when I was doing my undergraduate studies, as I said, we had a beca, and we went to the place where I studied. There, it's a residential school. So we all lived in the same place, 24/7 for 5 years. So I got to know all these people very, very well. And we are still very good friends. We have a reunion every 2 years, and everybody shows up at the reunion, no matter what part of the world they are at. So roughly half of them are still in India, the other half are not in India. But when we have reunion, everybody shows up. And we argue, we fight, just the way we used to do 40 years ago. But, you know, we transport back to where we were back when we were students. And it turns out that, you know, if any of us need anything, then somebody is there to help. So one of my friends had his son go to study in the US, and one of the other friends, he set up his apartment, he put him there, took care of him while he was studying, and so on. And that sort of help, you know, is hard to come by in a globalized world, because everybody is going everywhere else. The other thing that most people don't understand is that when you're trying something new, you don't necessarily succeed. I had a friend named Ed. So Ed, I always saw him going out with different women every time. So I said, Ed, how do you do it? So what he said was, why? If I like somebody, I just go out and ask them, would you go out with me? Most of them refuse, but it doesn't really matter. I just need one person at a time. So as long as one person agrees, that's great. Now that is one particular area of application, but this is a more general point. If you're looking for a job, for example, unless you apply for the job, you'll never get it. because you never applied. You know, it's like if you don't buy a lottery ticket, you will never win. So my dad used to say, you know, if you want to do something, try it. And the phrase he used was, unless you push the door, how do you know that the door was not open in the first place? If you push, it doesn't open, you realize it's locked. Okay, fine, try another door. And that's what Ed was doing, trying different doors. The other thing is that when you think about big things to do, not only you do it, you get other people to do the same. So for example, I have written a whole bunch of articles, not just by myself, but with other people, jointly. And often they come from different fields. So I've written papers with lawyers, I've written papers with doctors, I've written papers with persons I have never seen in my entire life. So I talk to them on Skype, and we collaborate, and we work together. So nowadays with technology, it has opened up to the whole wide world, literally. And a lot of the times you find other people, if you listen to them, other people may not contribute a lot on what you are trying to do, but think of it this way. If you are in a room and you think you are the smartest person in the room, you are in the wrong room. You want to be in a room where you can learn from other people. And that's another important thing to realize. Again, we don't realize that because we don't think about that all the time, but that's a very, very important element in life. And, you know, you can always learn new things. Somebody asked me the other day, now that you're retiring, what do you plan to do? I said, I want to learn C++ and Japanese. Why? Well, I always wanted to learn Japanese, and I always wanted to learn C++. I just never had enough time. What are you going to use it for? I have no clue. But it doesn't matter. And so that's, you know, that's what you have to do. So, for example, when I came to Mexico, I was 40, and people said, you know, at age 40 you cannot learn another language. It's not possible. That's not true. I took classes. You know, when I came here first, I was taking 15 hours of classes myself at ITAM. There's a place called CEPE, Centro de Enseñanza para Extranjeros. I was taking 15 hours of classes every single week, along with teaching here and doing all the stuff here. Every morning I'd go there at 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 to 10, I would take classes. And I did that for 2 years. And then I got reasonably fluent with that. Then I started teaching in Spanish. In the beginning, the students just hated that. They said, this guy doesn't know any Spanish at all. But over time, again, that got better. And eventually, I wrote several books that were in Spanish. So, you know, the point is that you can and do things if you are interested enough. One good example of that would be Michael Faraday. Michael Faraday had absolutely no education. He worked in a backbreaking work like coal mines and stuff. But then he worked as a bookbinder. Back in the days, books, you print them, cut them, and then you put them together and glue them together. So he was doing that stuff. And then he started reading the books that he was binding. So he basically read and educated himself. And then he had the fortune of becoming an assistant to be an assistant to a very famous scientist. And then eventually he worked his way up. He became a doctor of law. Back in those days, it was not PhD, it was doctor of law is what you got. So that's how he got. And then he was given knighthood, which he refused, saying that that will go in my head and I don't want that. So Michael Faraday became the president of the Royal Society. And that's, for a person who had no formal education whatsoever, that's just completely unheard of. But it can be done. There's a saying that says, life is what happens to us when you are making other plans. And that's very true. You just don't realize that life is happening until it's too late. Michael Faraday happened to be there when Sir Humphrey Davy needed an assistant. As I said, after I did my PhD, I was not planning to go anyplace else. I was teaching at a University of Wisconsin in the US, and one day one of my other colleagues who was in the next office, he said, I'm going to go on a sabbatical. I said, where are you going? He said, Singapore. I said, really? Where are you going to Singapore? He said, well, my wife is from Singapore, so I decided to go there. I said, are they looking for people? He said, I don't know. Send them a letter. So I said, now I remember what my dad said, unless you push the door, you don't know whether it was open. So I pushed the door, I sent them a letter. They said, yeah, we are hiring people, are you interested? Let's do an interview. So they had somebody from the National University of Singapore visiting the US, and that person interviewed me. It turned out that that person was actually leaving the university. He said, why do you want to go to Singapore? That's not really a great place. So he was trying to dissuade me from going to Singapore. But I said, hey, if I go to Singapore, which is close to India, and my mother was still alive then, and she lived in Calcutta, so I could hop on a plane. After breakfast, I could be having lunch with her the same day. And so I took the job. That's how I ended up in Singapore. Again, I was not planning to go to Australia. There was one guy who was visiting, and my head of the department said, could you give him to come and give a lecture in your class? I said, sure. So that guy came and gave a lecture. I took him out to lunch, and I said, chit-chatting, I said, what are you doing in Singapore? Are you visiting Singapore? He said, no, I'm actually from Singapore. I was in Australia. I was just on my way back to the US. So I said, what were you doing in Australia? He said, they're starting a new university. I said, they're hiring people? He said, I know the guy who's the rector of the university. If you're interested, I could send him an email and see. I said, okay, please give me his email number. I'll send him an email. And then he looked in. He said, oh, I don't have the email, but I have his fax number. Back then people use fax. So I sent him a fax. And then he wrote back saying, why don't you come for a visit? So I went and visited. Really liked the place. I said, I want to go. That's how I ended up in Australia. How did I end up in Mexico? Well, the dean of our school was at a conference. I ran into him. I didn't know him at all. I ran into him. He said, "We are having this 50-year anniversary of ITAM. Would you like to come and give a few lectures?" I said, "I've never been to Mexico. It's a good opportunity to visit." And when I came here, the rector said, "Would you like a job?" So I took the job. People in Australia thought I was completely crazy to leave Australia and come to Mexico for a job. That's another story. The other thing is that in bigger scheme of things, most people attach a lot of self-importance to themselves. Really, you or I or anybody else, not all that important. So, for example, I don't have a cell phone. People say, "You don't have a cell phone? How can you live without a cell phone?" Very easily. I have no problems not having a cell phone at all. I always say that in my business, if I don't immediately reply to somebody, nobody dies. If I were a doctor, maybe I would need a cell phone. And that's the thing. For most parts, life really goes on without you. And that really hit home one time. I was at a university, and the person who was next door to my office died. He was working at a university, and he just died. And, really somebody else was teaching his class, and everything was normal. So I had to help his wife to, clean up his office. And on the back side of his door, there was a sticky thing there saying, "We'll be back in 15 minutes. Then I realized he's never going to be back again. And for the rest of the world, it really doesn't matter. It didn't matter. Life just went on. And if you think of even a bigger scheme of things, there are 7 billion people in the world. If you look at all the people who have ever lived, it's 108 billion. So you and I are very, very small. And in the 4.5 billion history of the Earth, 100 years lived by one single person really makes no difference. Eventually, the sun will die out, and long before that, we will all die out as well. And if you think about, there are 400 billion stars in our Milky Way galaxy alone, and there are 170 billion in such galaxies. So there are 10 to the power of 24 stars. And we have no idea how many planets they have. Billions and billions of planets. And billions of living creatures in those planets. And as a result, if you think about it that way, in really, really big scheme of things of the universe, we are really small and unimportant. So, when people pretend that, unless they are doing whatever they are doing, the world is going to stop. That's not going to